The morning light was doing that thing it does in October, slanting through the Venetian blinds in thin copper bars, cutting across the mahogany desk where I had signed the papers for a $45,000 Mediterranean cruise nearly 14 months ago. I remember the exact weight of that pen in my hand. It was Diane's pen, the gold-tipped Mont Blanc she gave me on our 40th anniversary, and I had used it to sign because I wanted something of her to be part of the trip she never got to take. I was sitting in the leather chair in my home office when my phone rang and my son Derek's voice came through the speaker, calm and slick as motor oil on pavement. He said, and I will never forget these exact words as long as I live, "Dad, I need you to understand that Claudine's parents have never had a vacation like this, and frankly, your presence would make the dynamic really uncomfortable for everyone." The room went very quiet. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen down the hall. The copper bars of light stretched across the desk, and I looked at the framed photograph of Diane, taken on the cliffs of Positano, 1987, her hair blown sideways by the Mediterranean wind, laughing at something I had said. And I set the phone down on the desk very carefully, the way you set down a glass of water when you don't want to spill a single drop. Then I picked it back up, and in a voice so level it surprised even me, I said, "I see." Just those 2 words, because that was all they needed to hear from me, for now. Before I tell you exactly what happened next, how I got every cent of that $45,000 back, how I watched 2 people who thought they had outmaneuvered a 70-year-old widower discover the precise cost of that miscalculation, and how I boarded a very different ship 6 months later in a way that neither Derek nor his wife Claudine will ever be able to touch, I want you to sit with me for just a moment. Because this story is not really about a cruise. It is about what happens when people who owe you everything decide you are worth nothing. And it is about the specific and quiet kind of justice that only a patient man can deliver. Let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to teach an ungrateful family member a lesson they will never forget. You are going to want to stay until the very end of this one. My name is Diane Caldwell. I am 70 years old, and for 41 years I ran Caldwell Logistics Group, a regional freight and supply chain company I built out of a single leased truck, a laminated route map, and $400 in savings I had scraped together driving a forklift on the night shift at a cold storage facility in 1983. When I started, I had no investors, no family money, no safety net of any kind. My father had been a railroad worker who died of a stroke before he ever saw me succeed, and my mother cleaned houses until her knees gave out. Everything I built with the understanding that no one was coming to save me, so I had better become very good at saving myself. By the time I brought Derek into the company, after paying every dollar of his tuition at a very prestigious university in New England, plus his apartment, his car, his textbooks, his study abroad semester in Rome, and the security deposit on his first apartment after graduation, Caldwell Logistics was operating 14 regional hubs, running contracts with 3 Fortune 500 manufacturers, and generating just under $28 million in annual revenue. I gave Derek the title of Chief Operating Officer when he was 33, not because he had earned it, but because I loved him and because I believed in the version of him I had helped build. That was my first error of judgment. My wife Diane had been sick for 19 months before she died, pancreatic cancer, which is the kind that doesn't give you a lot of time to argue with. She spent her last 4 months at home, in the room we had shared for 43 years, and I sat beside her every evening and read to her from whatever she asked for, sometimes novels, sometimes old travel magazines, sometimes just the crossword. She loved the ocean. She always said her one great regret was that we had never taken a real Mediterranean cruise, the long kind, with stops at the Greek islands and the Italian coast and a day in Barcelona. I promised her we would go the following summer. She died on a Tuesday in February before that summer ever came. She was 68 years old, and she was the most decent person I have ever known, and the house has been very quiet ever since. I booked the cruise 4 months after her funeral, not because I had forgotten the promise, but because I had decided to honor it anyway, to go to the places she wanted to see and carry her there in some way I hadn't fully worked out yet. I booked a suite on a 14-night Mediterranean voyage departing from Rome, with stops in Santorini, Mykonos, Dubrovnik, Kotor, and Barcelona. The total cost, including 2 additional cabins for Derek and Claudine, was $45,000, paid in full by me, from my personal account in a single wire transfer. I told Derek about it over dinner at his house. He said, "That's incredible, Dad. Claudine is going to be thrilled." He smiled the way he always smiles, with his mouth and not his eyes. Claudine was not at dinner that night. She was rarely at any dinner where I was also present. I need you to understand something about Claudine before I go any further, because the story does not make full sense without it. Claudine is 36 years old, and she grew up in a household where money was always somewhere just over the horizon, close enough to want, too far to touch. She is not an intelligent woman. In fact, she is quite sharp, which is precisely what makes her dangerous. She never called me Dad. In 7 years of marriage to my son, she addressed me as Harrison in a tone that managed to make even my own name sound like an imposition. She wore designer clothes that Derek's salary did not fully cover and drove a vehicle I had subsidized through a company lease she convinced Derek to negotiate on her behalf. She had what I can only describe as a performer's relationship to emotion, her sympathy arriving precisely when it was most useful to her and departing the moment it was not.
Claudine's parents, Gerald and Pamela, were pleasant enough people who lived in a small house in suburban Ohio and had never, to my knowledge, traveled internationally. Gerald had retired early on a modest pension, and Pamela taught piano lessons from their living room. They were not the problem, they were simply the tool. Because what Claudine had decided, and I would later learn she had decided this over many months of careful whispered planning, was that the 2 cabins I had booked and paid for on my voyage to honor my dead wife's memory would be far better used by her parents, and that the suite I had reserved for myself could be reassigned to her and Derek while they bumped me from the manifest entirely. I discovered this not from Derek, who lacked the nerve to tell me himself, but from a reservation confirmation email that arrived in my inbox by accident. Claudine had used my email address as a secondary contact when she called the cruise line to modify the booking. I received the confirmation of changes at 9:14 on a Wednesday morning. I sat and read it 3 times. My name had been removed from the suite. Gerald and Pamela Voss were now listed as passengers in cabin 6204 and 6206. The suite had been transferred into Derek and Claudine's names. My $45,000 had paid for a trip from which I had been erased. I did not call Derek immediately. I poured a cup of coffee, walked to the window that looks out over the back garden, the one Diane used to tend every Saturday morning in her green rubber boots, pulling up weeds with a cheerfulness that I never fully understood, and I stood there for a long time. Then I went to my desk, and I began to make some notes. The first thing I did was call a woman named Patricia Holt, who had been handling my personal legal matters for 22 years and had also, at various points, served as corporate counsel for Caldwell Logistics. I told Patricia what I had found in the email confirmation. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Harrison, was this paid from a personal account or a business account?" I told her personal. She said, "Good. And was anything in writing regarding their inclusion on the reservation? Any formal agreement? Any addendum?" I said no, it had been entirely verbal and understood as a gift. She said, "Then we have options." What Patricia helped me understand over the next 2 days, as I quietly gathered documentation, was that the modification of a reservation paid in full by one party, executed without that party's knowledge or consent, using access to that party's booking credentials obtained through secondary contact information, was not simply rude. Depending on how the cruise line's terms of service were structured and how exactly Claudine had represented herself on that call, it could constitute something considerably more serious. Patricia said she would make some inquiries. But there was a second layer, and the second layer was the one that made my coffee go cold on the desk. When I went back through my personal financial records, something I did routinely every quarter, but with fresh eyes this time, I noticed that in the 14 months since I had brought Derek in as COO, there had been a series of vendor contract amendments that I had signed off on without examining closely because I had trusted my son to pre-screen them. I trusted him the way a man trusts his own right hand. 3 of those amendments, I now realized, had redirected a portion of recurring service fees to a vendor entity I did not recognize, a company called Voss Meridian Consulting, LLC. The last name in that company name is spelled exactly the way you think it is. I am a man who has been in business for 40 years. I did not throw the files across the room. I did not shout or break anything. I set the folder down on the desk and looked at the photograph of Diane and said very quietly, "All right." That was all. Because in business, when you discover that the rot goes deeper than the surface, the worst thing you can do is let the rot know that you have found it. I called my private investigator, a man named Robert Sanchez, who had spent 20 years as a federal agent before retiring into private work. I had used Robert twice before, once during a supplier fraud investigation, once during a partnership dispute, and he was the kind of man who delivered results without theater. I told him what I had found, sent him the vendor amendments and what I had been able to piece together about Voss Meridian Consulting, and asked him to dig. He called me back in 11 days with a dossier. We met at a diner off Route 9, a place with fluorescent lights and laminate tables and coffee that tasted like it had been sitting since dawn, and he slid a folder across the table to me without ceremony. Voss Meridian Consulting, LLC, had been registered in Delaware 18 months ago, 4 months before Derek officially joined Caldwell Logistics as COO. Its registered agent was a law firm in Wilmington. Its sole member, listed in the formation documents, was Claudine Ann Voss Caldwell. The company had received, across 11 separate wire transfers over 13 months, a total of $619,400 from Caldwell Logistics vendor payment accounts. The money had been routed through a series of mundane-sounding service invoices, consulting fees, process optimization review, third-party logistics audit, each signed off by Derek in his capacity as COO, each falling just below the threshold that would have automatically flagged them for my direct review. They had studied how our internal approval system worked. They had designed the scheme around its blind spots. They had built their theft inside the architecture of my trust in my own son. I sat in that diner for a long moment after Robert finished explaining. The fluorescent light buzzed slightly above our booth. Someone at the counter was ordering a grilled cheese sandwich. Outside, a truck with a Caldwell Logistics livery passed on the road, one of my trucks, running on the business I had built from nothing, and I watched it go, and then I folded my hands on top of the folder. "How solid is this?" I asked Robert. "Federal prosecution solid, wire fraud, interstate commerce. If they want to go through a corporate account, they've upgraded their crime category." I nodded once. "Then that's what we do." And I left a 20 on the table for the coffee. They had vastly underestimated the man they were trying to destroy. I want to tell you about what Diane would have said, because she matters to everything that comes next. Diane was not a vengeful person. She was also not a foolish one. She had a saying she used whenever someone had wronged us in business, some supplier who cut corners, some partner who misrepresented terms, some client who tried to renegotiate a contract after delivery. She would say, "Harrison, a person who steals from you once has told you everything you need to know about them. Your only obligation now is to believe what they've told you." She meant it practically, not bitterly. She was not asking me to punish anyone. She was asking me to stop pretending people were better than they had proven themselves to be.
I thought about that for a long time in the weeks that followed, sitting in the quiet house with the sound of October rain on the windows, and I decided that honoring Diane's memory meant protecting people who had desecrated it. It meant being as clear-eyed and precise as she would have been.
In business, when you find rot in the foundation, you do not scream at the rot. You locate every compromised beam, you document every crack, and then you tear the whole structure down with surgical efficiency so that what you build in its place is sound. That is what I began to do. I want you to understand the architecture of what came next, because it did not happen in a single dramatic confrontation. It happened slowly, deliberately, and in complete silence, the way the most consequential things in business always happen. While Derek and Claudine went about their lives, scheduling dinners with Gerald and Pamela, presumably discussing embarkation logistics for a cruise they believed they had secured, I was meeting quietly with a man named Victor Lang. Victor is 57 years old and has been my corporate attorney for 31 years. He is not a warm man. He is precise, economical, and possessed of a legal mind that I have seen dismantle 2 hostile takeover attempts and 3 partner fraud cases with the kind of unhurried, methodical pressure that reminds me of water finding its way through limestone. When I laid out the full picture for Victor, the cruise reservation manipulation, the $619,400 in fraudulent vendor payments through Voss Meridian Consulting, the insider access Derek had used to structure the scheme, Victor listened without interruption, and when I finished, he said, "What is your preferred outcome?" I told him. He said, "Then we begin Monday." Victor's team spent 3 weeks preparing documentation packages. Robert Sanchez delivered supplementary surveillance records, including cellular location data that placed Derek in a meeting with Claudine's cousin, a commercial real estate attorney in New Jersey, on the same day that the 3rd largest fraudulent transfer had been initiated. They had been planning a property purchase with stolen funds. An investment property in coastal Connecticut listed at $1.1 million with a deposit of $87,500 already placed using a personal account Claudine had funded through distributions from Voss Meridian. Victor filed a complaint with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit in Boston on a Wednesday. Federal investigators took 4 business days to review the documentation and issue investigative subpoenas. Robert had contacts from his federal service who could accelerate the process without compromising it, and he managed those relationships quietly. Asset freezes were placed on Voss Meridian Consulting, on Claudine's personal accounts, and on a joint account she and Derek held at a regional bank in Connecticut, all before either of them received any notification. The accounts were frozen on a Friday afternoon. By Monday morning, their debit cards would not work at a coffee shop. All of this happened while I continued to show up at the office in a manner designed to be completely unremarkable. I was the aging founder, increasingly deferential to his son, spending long afternoons reviewing old project files. I let Derek run meetings I would normally have chaired. I nodded at his recommendations. I mentioned the cruise once in a hallway conversation and told him I completely understood that I had been feeling tired lately anyway, and the Mediterranean heat might not have agreed with me. And I watched the flicker of something cross his face. Relief, I think, maybe the faintest edge of guilt, quickly suppressed. He patted my shoulder and said, "We'll do something special when we get back, Dad." I smiled. I said, "Of course." I went back to my office and sat in the leather chair and thought about Diane, the way she used to hum to herself when she was in the garden, unaware that anyone was listening. I thought, 1 more week. There was a Tuesday evening when I stayed late enough that I watched Claudine arrive at the office. She rarely came, but she had apparently decided to help Derek review some operational files, which tells you exactly how comfortable they had become. And through the glass partition of the conference room, I could see her walking along the corridor with her hand trailing across the top of the reception counter, as if she were already taking inventory of what she planned to change. She paused at the framed photograph of the original Caldwell logistics truck, the one I had leased in 1983, the one I kept as a reminder of where the company began, and I watched her look at it for a moment and then keep walking, indifferent. She was wearing a silk blouse I had never seen before, new, expensive. I noted it in a way I did not react to and turned back to my desk. The trap was fully set. The accounts were frozen. The subpoenas were in place. Victor had prepared a comprehensive document package for simultaneous delivery. Robert's surveillance records were archived and authenticated. All that remained was the final conversation. I called Derek and asked him to come to the office on Thursday morning for what I described as a routine business review. I asked him to bring Claudine because, I said, there were some operational matters that involved her advisory role, a role, I noted carefully, that she had been performing on an informal basis. He said they would be there at 9. I arrived at 7. I sat at my desk in the office where I had spent 30 years building something real, and I let the room be what it was. I turned the desk lamp to a low angle. I set Diane's photograph where it always sat, in its place to the left of the blotter. I did not comb my hair particularly care. I wore the old gray cardigan that I sometimes wore when I was not expecting visitors, because I wanted them to see exactly the version of me they expected. The tired old man, soft at the edges, already half receded from his own life. They arrived at 5 minutes past 9. Claudine was in heels and a dark jacket, dressed for a different kind of meeting than she thought she was having. Derek carried a leather portfolio, which struck me as faintly theatrical for a routine review. They sat across the desk from me, and I offered them coffee, and they both declined, which told me they wanted to be efficient. Good. Claudine opened the meeting by suggesting, in a tone of practiced gentleness, that it might be worth discussing transitional planning, a phrase she had clearly rehearsed. She said something about my well-being and about how the company would benefit from a clearer succession structure and about how Derek was ready to take on full leadership responsibilities. She said all of this while looking not quite at me, but at a point just past my left ear, the way people look when they are delivering a script rather than a thought. Derek watched me. He had the look of a man waiting for a floor to give way beneath someone else.
I let her finish. Then I looked at my son, not at Claudine, at Derek, and I held that look for a long moment. It was the look I had given him once when he was 17 and had lied to me about something small and been caught, and I remembered that even then, even at 17, he could not hold my eyes for more than a few seconds. He looked at the desk, he looked at his portfolio, he looked at his wife. He did not look at me. The door to the possibility of him doing the right thing closed very quietly, and I let it close, because now there was no mercy left to offer. I said, "Thank you, Claudine. I appreciate the thoroughness." I looked at my watch. I said, "Victor should be here by now." Victor Lang entered through the side door of my office at precisely 9:17, accompanied by 2 associates from his firm carrying sealed document packets, and followed, after a gap of perhaps 30 seconds, by 2 federal agents, not in uniform but carrying credentials they produced without theater and placed on the desk in front of me. One of them said, "Mr. Caldwell, we apologize for the disruption." I said, "Not at all." Claudine stood up. That was her first real tell, the standing up, the physical instinct to leave before she understood what was happening. One of the federal agents said her full name. He said it the way federal agents say names, which is with a specific flatness that removes all ambiguity about the nature of the moment. He said that she was being detained for questioning in connection with a federal wire fraud investigation involving interstate commercial transfers totaling $619,400. He said this calmly, as if reciting a departure time. And the room, the office I had built my company inside, the room with the mahogany desk and the framed photograph of the original truck and the leather chairs that had held the weight of 40 years of decisions, went absolutely still. Derek said,
"What?" His voice came out small, like something that had lost its frame. Victor set a certified document packet in front of Derek. He said, "This is a termination of employment effective immediately, a notice of disinheritance executed under the terms of the Revocable Living Trust established in 2019, a demand for repayment of $619,400 in fraudulently obtained vendor payments, and an eviction notice for the company leased property you currently occupy at 14 Birchwood Lane." He said it the way you read a list of items in a grocery order. Orderly. Final. Derek looked at the packet. He looked at Claudine. And in that moment, and this is the part I will carry with me for the rest of my life, not with pleasure, but with a kind of cold clarity, I watched the architecture of their partnership collapse in real time. Claudine turned to Derek and said in a voice stripped of all its practiced warmth, "Did you not get rid of the vendor files like I told you to?" Derek stared at her. His face went through several expressions very quickly: disbelief, then fury, then something that looked almost like the ghost of the boy he used to be, before she had finished remaking him. He said, "You said you had handled the documentation." She said, "I told you to handle the documentation." The federal agents watched this exchange with the polite professional attention of people who have seen it many times before. One of the agents placed his hand on Claudine's arm, not roughly, but with the particular firmness of official contact, and she looked down on his hand as if she could not quite process what it meant for her. The other agent addressed Derek and told him that he was not under arrest at this time, but that he was required to make himself available for federal questioning, and that obstruction of the ongoing investigation would constitute a separate criminal offense. Derek nodded. He was nodding to everything, the way people nod when all the scripts have run out. The handcuffs, they were standard issue, stainless, and they clicked with a sound that is very specific, a sound you do not forget once you have heard it in a room where you know the person wearing them, went on Claudine's wrists as she was escorted for formal detention pending the first federal hearing. She did not cry. That surprised me slightly, and then it did not, because Claudine had always been a person who performed emotion rather than felt it, and there was no audience left worth performing for. I sat at my desk and did not move. I looked at Diane's photograph. I did not feel triumph. I want to be honest with you about that, because people sometimes expect triumph, and I think triumph is a shallow thing. What I felt was something closer to the feeling at the end of a very long construction project. Not joy exactly, but the specific quiet satisfaction of a structure that has been built correctly, that will hold. Victor's team, working simultaneously with the cruise line's legal department, had already initiated a full chargeback of the $45,000 booking on the grounds of unauthorized modification of a reservation held in my name. The cruise line's fraud team had flagged the modification within 12 hours of being contacted once they reviewed their call records and confirmed that Claudine had misrepresented her authority over the booking. The full $45,000 was returned to my personal account within 9 business days. The Connecticut investment property, the $1.1 million coastal property they had planned to purchase with a deposit drawn from Voss Meridian Distributions, was flagged by the asset freeze before closing could occur. The deposit of $87,500 was recaptured as part of the federal asset forfeiture proceedings. The property never closed. The listing went back to market. Over the following 4 months, as the federal case progressed, the full scope of the scheme was reconstructed by investigators. The total amount misappropriated from Caldwell Logistics, including the $619,400 in vendor payments and additional undisclosed distributions from subsidiary accounts that Robert had flagged in a supplementary report, came to $847,200. Every dollar was subject to federal forfeiture orders. Claudine entered a guilty plea to federal wire fraud and conspiracy charges. She was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison and ordered to make full restitution. Derek, whose cooperation with investigators was determined to have been partial at best, was convicted at trial of 1 count of wire fraud in connection with his authorization of the vendor payments. He received a sentence of 4 years and was released from the company, from the trust, and from any claim on the estate in its entirety.
Gerald and Pamela Voss, Claudine's parents, were never charged with anything. They had not known the source of their daughter's money. When the story became public, and it became modestly public in the way that local business fraud cases do, with a brief note in the regional business journal, I sent Gerald a handwritten letter. I told him I had no grievance with him and that his daughter's choices were not his burden to carry. He wrote back a short note on plain paper and thanked me. That was the end of that. In the months that followed, I did several things that mattered to me. I reinstated the 4 Caldwell Logistics employees who had been quietly marginalized or dismissed during Derek's tenure as COO, 3 operations managers, and a senior dispatcher named Frank Okafor, who had been with the company for 19 years and was, in my view, among the finest logistics minds I had ever employed. Frank came back at a salary 30% higher than what he had left. He cried when I called him. That was a hard phone call for me in the best possible way. I commissioned an independent audit of all vendor contracts executed during Derek's tenure as COO. The audit identified an additional $228,000 in overpayments to entities connected to Voss Meridian that had not been captured in the initial investigation. That money was recovered and distributed back into the employee pension accounts from which operating budget had been quietly redirected. Every pension account was made whole. The total restoration came to $1,075,200, which is a number I made sure every employee heard directly from me in a company-wide meeting I held in the warehouse, standing on the same loading dock where I had signed my very first freight contract in 1984. I established the Diane Caldwell Foundation, funded with 50% of my personal net worth, which at the time of its establishment represented $14.3 million. The foundation's charter directs its resources toward scholarships for first-generation college students in logistics, supply chain, and operations management, fields where an education can genuinely transform a trajectory, just as it might have transformed mine if I had been able to access one at 20 years old. The scholarship carries Diane's name because she believed, more than anyone I have ever known, that education was the one thing no one could take from you once you had it. The first cohort of Diane Caldwell Foundation scholars, 12 students from 7 states, began their programs in the fall. I transferred the remaining 50% of my personal holdings, plus a controlling equity stake in Caldwell Logistics Group itself, to an employee stock ownership plan, making the company's 412 employees its collective owners. The transition was executed over 90 days with Victor's oversight and the assistance of an ESOP specialist brought in from Chicago. When the paperwork was complete, I stood again on that loading dock and I looked at the people who had actually built this company, the dispatchers and the mechanics and the operations coordinators and the warehouse supervisors and the drivers who had spent their careers moving things from one place to another with care and reliability. And I told them that the company was theirs now, that I had merely been keeping it for them. There was a long silence. And then Frank Okafor started clapping, and then the whole dock was clapping, and I turned away because I didn't want them to see my face. I booked a new cruise 3 months later, not the same itinerary, a different one, 15 nights departing from Lisbon with stops in the Azores, Madeira, the Canary Islands, and the Moroccan coast, a route Diane had once circled in a travel magazine she kept in her nightstand drawer,
a dog-eared copy I found when I cleaned out her things. I booked a suite. I paid for it from my personal account using a different method than the wire transfer I had used 14 months before, because some things you simply do not revisit. I traveled alone because honest was honest. I sat on the deck in the Atlantic mornings with coffee and watched the ocean do what the ocean does, enormous and indifferent and somehow comforting. And I brought Diane with me in the only way that was left to me, which was to see things as she would have seen them, with attention and without complaint. In Madeira, I walked through a flower market that smelled of jasmine and sea salt. In the Canary Islands, I sat at an outdoor table and ate grilled fish and watched the light change over the harbor. In Morocco, I bought a small painted tile at a stall in the Medina in Essaouira, blue and white, the colors of the Atlantic. I still have it on my desk next to Diane's photograph. When I came home, the house was still quiet. It is still quiet. That part does not change. But I have learned something that I want to leave you with, because I think it matters. There is a difference between quiet that is empty and quiet that is full. The quiet in my house now is full of things that will outlast me. A foundation that will send students to college for decades, a company owned by the people who built it, a name in a scholarship that will be spoken by people who never met her. That is not emptiness. That is the specific kind of abundance that cannot be stolen, cannot be rebooked without your knowledge, cannot be redirected into a Delaware LLC. It is what is left when you have done the right thing with sufficient patience and sufficient precision. Family is not defined by blood. It is defined by absolute loyalty. A lone wolf may lose his mate, but he never loses his teeth. I used to ride upon your shoulders, thinking you could touch the sky. You carried all our dreams like mountains, never once would ask me why. I was small, and you were steady, never let me see your fears. Now I understand the silence, hiding strength behind the years. I am my father's daughter, quiet in the storm. I learned from watching you hold on through every cold and every warn. You never raised your voice in anger, never let the bitter win. I am my father's daughter, built from grace and discipline. They tried to take the things you built. They thought you'd bend and break. They never saw the man who started with a truck and a dream, who learned that what looks like surrender is the setup for the scheme. I am my father's daughter, patient like the tide. The ones who counted you for finished didn't look at what was inside. You were never really losing, you were letting them believe, and everything they thought they'd taken, you were waiting to retrieve. The granite on your desk, the mahogany in the hall, the way you stood without an outburst when you had the hardest call. You taught me that the loudest anger is the weakest kind of pain, and that the ones who take in silence are the ones who will remain. I am my father's daughter, still learning how you do, how you carry what is broken and come out completely new, how you speak of what has hurt you without bitterness or blame, how you carry someone's memory like it's still a living flame.
Because Mama used to hum in the garden, green boots in the morning soil, and you read to her in the evenings after all that long day's toil. And when they took the cruise from you, the one that carried her name, you didn't scream, you didn't shatter, you just quietly reclaimed. I am my father's daughter, standing where you stood, knowing quiet is its own kind of power when it's understood. You gave your life to something larger than the injuries they made, and the name above the scholarship is never gonna fade. So here's to the ones who steady themselves and never show the fall, the ones who build foundations when they've got their backs against the wall, the ones who lose a love like Diane and still get up each day, who find another ocean and keep going anyway. I am my father's daughter. I am my father's daughter. I am my father's daughter, and I will be
until my very last day. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone who kept their dignity when others tried to take it, leave their name in the comments. And if you know someone who needs to hear this today, someone who is sitting in a quiet house wondering if patience and integrity still mean anything, send it to them. It does. It always has. Good night.